Imagine being remembered not for your life, not for your thoughts or dreams, but for the sheer number of children you were forced to father, over 200 of them, like a prized animal in a cruel experiment. This isn't a myth or a fable, it's a documented horror. It's the story of Pata Seca, a towering enslaved man used as a human stud by his master, and it happened not in some ancient forgotten empire, but in the 19th century, in the Americas. His body became a breeding machine, his children became currency, and the system that demanded it, one of the most sinister institutions in human history, slave breeding. In the early 1800s, as the world took tentative steps toward outlawing the transatlantic slave trade, an even more insidious chapter began to unfold behind plantation walls. In January 1808, the United States and Britain permanently banned the importation of African slaves. Ships would no longer carry chained men, women, and children from the coasts of West Africa to the Americas, at least not legally. But abolition of the slave trade did not mean abolition of slavery, quite the opposite. This shift ignited panic among slaveholders. Their supply of enslaved labor was drying up, even as the demand for it reached unprecedented heights. The American South and the Caribbean were in the midst of a massive agricultural boom. Cotton, rice, and sugar were no longer just crops, they were the engines of empires. The cotton gin, recently invented by Eli Whitney, made it possible to process short staple cotton far more efficiently. Suddenly, land previously considered useless was now a goldmine, if only there were enough enslaved people to work it. But disease, malnutrition, grueling hours, and relentless abuse ensured that slave mortality remained high. With no new Africans arriving and with existing populations declining, plantation owners turned to a chillingly calculated alternative: reproduction by force. Thus began the era of systematic slave breeding. Women were reduced to reproductive vessels, men to genetic stock. Human beings became self-replicating property. Female slaves were forced to bear child after child, with no regard for their health, consent, or emotional well-being. And towering, strong-bodied men were chosen to impregnate them, not once but repeatedly across dozens of women. This was not a fringe practice. It was mainstream, orchestrated, and deliberately cruel. This is the world that forged the legend of Pata Seca, also known as Pataseka, or by his full name, José Florencio Pateca. He was an enslaved African born in Brazil, a country that would not abolish slavery until 1888, the last in the Western world to do so. But long before that, Pataseka's fate was sealed. He was a giant of a man, 7 feet, 2 inches tall, with disproportionately long legs and huge hands and feet. Among the enslaved, he was nicknamed Pata Seca, meaning dry paw, perhaps a nod to his unusual build or a dark joke about his condition. But to his master, Francisco Duna Bueno, Pata Seca's body was a gold mine. Pata Seca was spared field labor. Instead, he was given unusual privileges for an enslaved person. He delivered messages, tended livestock, and rode horseback between farms and towns. But his real assignment was far more disturbing. He was chosen to be a breeder. Slaveholders believed certain physical traits were hereditary. Tall, strong men were expected to sire similarly strong offspring. Light skin, angular faces, and specific body proportions were all considered desirable traits that could boost the value of a slave on the market. So men like Pata Seca were forced into sexual encounters with enslaved women, selected for breeding, sometimes daily. These were not intimate relationships. They were violent acts of institutionalized rape. Pata Seca had no choice. He was compelled to father child after child, each one born into bondage, each one counted not as family, but as capital. To plantation owners, these children were future laborers, future profit, future currency, and Pata Seca, he was no more than a cog in the reproductive machine. Today, it's estimated that around 30% of the modern population in the Santa Eudoxia district of São Carlos, Brazil, can trace their lineage back to him. His genes spread not by legacy, but by force. But this is not a story of legacy, it's a story of loss. Pataseka never met the majority of his children. He never got to hold them, name them, raise them. They were taken from their mothers, often before they could walk. They were sold to distant plantations, separated from their siblings, and stripped of any familial identity. These children were doomed to live as tools, picking cotton under the scorching sun, cleaning houses for the very people who enslaved their parents, enduring beatings for minor infractions, and being denied education to ensure their obedience. Educating an enslaved child was considered dangerous. Knowledge could spark rebellion. And so, entire generations were kept ignorant on purpose, forced to grow up without literacy, hope, or the freedom to imagine a better life. The brutality these children endured was relentless. They were whipped, shackled, and humiliated. Their innocence was stolen, their emotions dismissed, their pain normalized. And all the while, Pataseka remained a prisoner of flesh, treated as valuable livestock. His health was monitored, his food was better than that of the field slaves, not out of kindness, but to preserve his breeding potential. His entire worth was tied to his ability to reproduce. This system didn't just commodify people, it reprogrammed generations to see themselves as worthless. It destroyed families before they could begin. Yet Pataseka endured, and when Brazil finally abolished slavery in 1888, his life changed. He was given a plot of land by his former master, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of gratitude for the hundreds of enslaved laborers Pataseka had helped create. On that land, Pataseka built something of his own. He married a woman named Palmyra, and together they raised 9 children, the only children he would ever truly know. He named his land Sitio Poasa and began producing rapadura, a raw cane sugar sold in blocks. It was backbreaking work, but it was his farm, his family, his freedom. For the first time in his life, Pataseka lived as a man, not a commodity, but there remained a permanent, aching void. He never reunited with the hundreds of children he had fathered during his enslavement. There were no records to trace them, no names to search, no paper trail, because they had never been treated like people to begin with. That is perhaps the most haunting part of Pataseka's legacy, the erasure of bloodlines, the destruction of roots, the deliberate forgetting. His story is not one of triumph but of endurance, of a man who lived through systemic sexual exploitation, who became the foundation for an entire community's genetic lineage, yet died never knowing who his children became. This is the untold story of slavery, not just chains and whips, but of forced reproduction, stolen parenthood, and the cold arithmetic of human profit. The story of Pataseka reveals the industrial scale of cruelty masked behind the polite veils of agriculture and commerce. And for every Pataseka, there were hundreds more whose names we'll never know. We remember him not just for the children he was forced to father, but for surviving a system that tried to strip him of everything that made him human.